Martha Chun adjusted her reading glasses and studied the complex algorithm displayed across 3 monitors in the corner office of Innovex Solutions. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mahogany desk where she had spent the last 15 years organizing files, scheduling meetings, and quietly observing the inner workings of what everyone believed to be Richard Blackwood's technological empire. At 42, Martha had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the corporate headquarters like a ghost who understood every technical specification, every line of code, every innovation that had built the company from a startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. Richard burst through the office doors with his characteristic swagger, his expensive Italian suit crisp despite the long day of back-to-back investor meetings. He glanced at Martha with the casual dismissal of someone who had never bothered to learn her last name despite her nameplate sitting on the desk for over a decade. Martha, he called her, always just Martha, as if she were a household appliance that happened to possess the ability to type and answer phones. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his confidence radiating from every pore as he surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself to be a self-made genius. The algorithm Martha had been reviewing represented 18 months of development work, a revolutionary approach to data compression that would transform how businesses managed digital storage. Richard had spent the morning presenting it to a room full of venture capitalists, describing in passionate detail how his brilliant mind had conceived this breakthrough during a moment of inspiration while reviewing quarterly reports. He spoke of sleepless nights spent perfecting the mathematical foundations, of breakthrough moments that had come to him in flashes of pure innovation. The investors had hung on every word, their eyes lighting up with dollar signs as Richard painted a picture of market domination and unprecedented returns. Martha carefully closed the development files she had been cross-referencing, her movements precise and economical as always. She had been present for every one of those supposed breakthrough moments Richard had described to the investors. She had watched him struggle to understand basic programming concepts, had seen him delegate every technical decision to subordinates while taking credit for their discoveries. The irony was not lost on her that Richard's most compelling stories of innovation were actually memories of late nights, when Martha herself had worked through complex problems, developing solutions that Richard would later present as his own intellectual property. Those of you watching from your offices or homes today probably know the feeling of having your ideas overlooked or dismissed by someone in authority. Have you ever experienced a situation where your contributions went unrecognized? I'd love to hear where you're watching from and whether you've encountered similar workplace dynamics in your own career. These stories of hidden truth and delayed justice seem to resonate from coast to coast, and your location might surprise us all. The boardroom presentation that morning had been particularly galling for Martha to witness. Richard had stood before the polished conference table, gesturing grandly at charts and graphs that Martha had prepared, explaining technical concepts with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. When one investor had asked a detailed question about the algorithm's memory allocation efficiency, Richard had smoothly deflected by suggesting that such technical minutiae were below the level of strategic discussion they were having. Martha had bit her tongue, knowing that she could have answered that question with mathematical precision, could have explained every optimization and trade-off that made the solution elegant. Richard's dismissive attitude toward Martha had become more pronounced as Innovex Solutions grew in value and recognition. In the early days, when the company operated out of a converted warehouse with second-hand furniture and dreams of eventual success, Richard had at least acknowledged Martha's presence with occasional nods or brief expressions of gratitude. Now, as CEO of a company valued at over $2 billion, he treated her with the casual indifference reserved for office equipment that had outlived its usefulness but hadn't yet broken down completely. The transformation of Richard's attitude had been gradual but unmistakable. Success had fed his ego until he genuinely believed his own mythology, until he had convinced himself that the innovations bearing his name were products of his exceptional intellect rather than collaborative efforts he had claimed as personal achievements. Martha had watched this psychological evolution with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. She had seen how power and recognition could corrupt someone's fundamental relationship with truth, How repeated praise for stolen accomplishments could eventually convince the thief that the theft had never occurred. Martha's actual qualifications remained invisible to everyone at Innovex Solutions except the Human Resources Department, where her personnel file gathered dust in a cabinet that no one ever accessed. Her master's degree in computer science from MIT, her doctoral work in algorithmic optimization, her published papers on data compression theory that had been cited by researchers around the world. All of it carefully omitted from office conversations. All of it deliberately obscured behind the comfortable fiction that she was simply Richard's long-serving secretary who happened to be unusually good at organizing technical documents. The decision to remain in the shadows had been Martha's choice, motivated by circumstances that made steady employment more valuable than professional recognition. Her elderly parents required constant medical care, her younger brother struggled with disabilities that demanded financial support, and her daughter was working toward her own engineering degree at Stanford. The reliable paycheck and health insurance that came with being Richard's secretary had provided stability that pursuing credit for her innovations might have jeopardized. She had made a calculated sacrifice, trading recognition for security, betting that truth would eventually surface when the timing was right. Richard's voice interrupted Martha's reflections as he demanded that she compile all documentation related to the compression algorithm for review by the legal department. A competitor had been making noise about potential patent disputes, he explained with obvious irritation, and the lawyers needed to verify that everything was properly protected. Martha nodded with the practiced subservience that had served her well for 15 years, already knowing that the coming legal review would uncover far more than Richard bargained for. The irony of Richard asking Martha to gather evidence of his own intellectual property theft would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Every patent application, every development milestone, every technical specification existed in meticulous detail within files that Martha had maintained with the precision of someone who understood the eventual importance of documentary evidence. She had spent years creating an unbreakable chain of evidence that would someday prove exactly who had conceived, developed, and refined the innovations that had built Richard's empire. As Martha began pulling files from the secured storage system, she reflected on the strange satisfaction that came from watching someone unknowingly orchestrate their own downfall. Richard's demand for comprehensive documentation was exactly the trigger that would expose the careful fiction he had constructed around his supposed technical genius. The patents he claimed as his intellectual property, the algorithms he presented as products of his innovation, the breakthrough discoveries he credited to his exceptional insight. All of it existed in Martha's careful records, all of it traceable to her actual contributions, all of it protected by timestamps and documentation that would make denial impossible. Richard left the office with his usual dramatic flourish, calling over his shoulder that he expected the complete file compilation by morning. Martha smiled slightly as she heard his footsteps echo down the marble hallway, knowing that his casual dismissiveness was about to create consequences he couldn't imagine. The legal review he had so confidently ordered would become the instrument of his own destruction, the moment when 15 years of stolen credit would finally demand accounting. The algorithm displayed across Martha's monitors represented more than just technical innovation. It was the culmination of a decade and a half spent building an unshakable foundation of evidence while allowing someone else to claim the glory. Every line of code, every mathematical proof, every optimization had been carefully documented and preserved, creating a record that would eventually speak with undeniable authority about who had actually created the innovations that built Innovex Solutions into the technological powerhouse it had become. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Martha Chen's professional life into before and after. She signed for the thick envelope while Richard Blackwood was delivering another triumphant presentation to potential overseas investors, his voice carrying down the hallway as he regaled them with tales of his technological prowess and visionary leadership. The return address bore the imposing letterhead of Morrison, Pierce & Associates, attorneys representing TechCorp Industries, and the weight of the envelope suggested that its contents would not be the routine correspondence that typically crossed Martha's desk. Martha set the letter aside with practiced patience, continuing her morning routine of organizing Richard's calendar and preparing briefing materials for his afternoon meetings. She had learned long ago that urgent matters often became less urgent when approached with methodical calm. And her 15 years as Richard's secretary had taught her that corporate crises revealed their true nature only after careful examination. The sealed envelope seemed to radiate importance from its position on the corner of her desk, but Martha resisted the impulse to open correspondence addressed to Richard during his absence. Richard returned from his investor presentation with characteristic enthusiasm, his face flushed with the excitement that always followed successful performances before potential funding sources. He strode into the office with the confidence of someone who had just secured another round of financial backing for his supposedly revolutionary innovations, his Italian leather shoes clicking authoritatively against the polished marble floor. Martha handed him the certified letter with the same neutral expression she maintained for all correspondence, watching carefully as his eyes focused on the return address, and his confident smile faltered slightly. The transformation in Richard's demeanor was immediate and dramatic as he tore open the envelope and began reading the legal documents contained within. His face cycled through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and growing panic as he absorbed the contents of what was clearly a substantial legal filing. Martha continued organizing files with apparent indifference while observing Richard's reaction through her peripheral vision, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he turned each page of what appeared to be an extensive legal complaint. TechCorp Industries was filing a comprehensive patent infringement lawsuit against Innovex Solutions, claiming that Richard's company had violated dozens of their intellectual property rights across multiple product lines and technological innovations. The lawsuit demanded immediate cessation of all infringing activities, complete disclosure of development processes and financial records, and damages that could potentially reach hundreds of millions of dollars. Most damaging of all, TechCorp was requesting judicial review of all patent applications filed by Innovex Solutions over the past 2 decades, claiming that systematic intellectual property theft had been the foundation of Richard's entire business empire. Richard's initial reaction was to dismiss the lawsuit as frivolous harassment from a failing competitor trying to undermine Innovex Solutions through legal intimidation rather than marketplace competition. He spent the remainder of the morning making angry phone calls to his general counsel, demanding aggressive countermeasures and threatening to file malicious prosecution charges against TechCorp for daring to challenge his legitimate intellectual property rights. His voice carried throughout the executive suite as he ranted about corporate espionage and business jealousy, his confidence gradually returning as he convinced himself that superior legal representation would quickly dispose of these baseless accusations. Martha listened to Richard's phone conversations with growing interest, noting the specific technical patents that TechCorp was challenging and cross-referencing them mentally with her detailed knowledge of their actual development history. Each patent mentioned in the lawsuit corresponded to innovations she had personally conceived, developed, and refined during late nights and weekends when Richard was attending social functions or playing golf with potential investors. The irony was not lost on her that Richard's most passionate defenses of his intellectual property rights were actually defenses of her stolen innovations. The legal team at Morrison, Pierce & Associates had clearly conducted extensive research before filing their complaint. Their documentation included detailed technical analyses comparing patented algorithms, time-stamped evidence of prior art that predated Innovex Solutions' patent applications, and expert testimony from computer scientists who had identified unmistakable similarities between contested technologies. Most concerning for Richard was their request for complete discovery of all development records, original documentation, and correspondence related to the disputed patents. Richard's general counsel, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Summers who specialized in intellectual property defense, arrived at Innovex Solutions within hours of receiving Richard's panicked phone calls. She brought with her a team of junior associates and paralegals who immediately began the process of inventorying all documentation related to the disputed patents. Patricia's reputation for aggressive litigation tactics had made her extremely expensive, but Richard's desperation had overcome his usual concern for legal fees as he realized the potential consequences of losing this lawsuit. Martha found herself assigned to assist the legal team in gathering and organizing all documentation related to the contested patents. Patricia Summers had specifically requested that Martha compile every file, email, development note, and piece of correspondence that might be relevant to proving Richard's legitimate ownership of the disputed intellectual property. The request was made with the assumption that Martha, as Richard's long-serving secretary, would have maintained meticulous records of his innovative work and could provide the documentary foundation needed to defeat TechCorp's accusations. The assignment represented a moment of profound irony that Martha savored privately while maintaining her professional demeanor. She was being asked to provide evidence of Richard's intellectual property theft in order to help him defend against accusations of intellectual property theft. Every document she would compile would actually prove TechCorp's case rather than Richard's. Every piece of evidence would demonstrate that the patents Richard claimed as his innovations were actually based on her original work. Richard's anxiety became more apparent as the legal team's investigation progressed, and they began requesting specific types of documentation that he could not readily provide. Patricia Summers asked for original development notes showing Richard's thought processes during the creation of disputed algorithms, preliminary sketches demonstrating his conceptual approaches to technical problems, and correspondence with technical consultants who had supposedly assisted him during the innovation process. Each request revealed another gap in the documentary record that Richard had never thought to fabricate during his years of claiming credit for Martha's work. Martha began the process of compiling files with the same methodical precision she brought to all professional tasks, organizing documents chronologically and cross-referencing them with patent application dates and technical specifications. She worked late into the evening while Richard paced nervously in his office, making increasingly frantic phone calls to potential witnesses who might corroborate his version of events. The contrast between Martha's calm efficiency and Richard's growing desperation was becoming apparent to the legal team, who noted her unusual familiarity with complex technical documentation. The first concerning discovery emerged when Martha presented Patricia Summers with the original patent applications from 15 years earlier. The handwriting on the technical specifications was clearly not Richard's, despite his signature on the formal application documents. The mathematical proofs and algorithmic explanations were written in a precise, feminine script that bore no resemblance to Richard's hasty scrawl. When questioned about the discrepancy, Richard claimed that Martha had simply transcribed his verbal instructions and rough sketches into more legible format for official filing. Patricia Summers's expression grew increasingly skeptical as she reviewed more of the documentary evidence that Martha had compiled. The technical language in the original patent applications demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex computer science concepts that seemed inconsistent with Richard's background and educational history. The mathematical proofs were elegant and precise, showing deep familiarity with algorithmic optimization theory that Richard had never demonstrated in any other context. Most puzzling was the consistent quality of technical documentation across multiple patents spanning more than a decade, suggesting a single brilliant mind rather than the collaborative efforts Richard claimed to have coordinated. Martha's strange calmness during the legal review process began attracting attention from the investigating team. While Richard became increasingly agitated and defensive when questioned about technical details, Martha displayed comprehensive knowledge of every patent, every algorithm, and every innovative breakthrough that had built Innovex solutions. She could explain complex mathematical relationships without referring to notes, could recall specific development challenges and their solutions with perfect clarity, and demonstrated familiarity with technical literature that supported the original innovations. The legal team's investigation was revealing a pattern that made Patricia Summers deeply uncomfortable about her client's prospects for successful defense. The documentary evidence was beginning to suggest that Richard Blackwood might not be the innovative genius he claimed to be, and that the intellectual property rights he was fighting to defend might not legitimately belong to him. Each piece of evidence that Martha provided seemed to support TechCorp's accusations rather than refute them, creating a growing sense that this lawsuit would expose secrets that went far deeper than simple patent disputes. Richard's panic was becoming impossible to conceal as the scope of the legal investigation expanded and more questions arose about the authenticity of his claimed innovations. He began coaching Martha on how to respond to questions from the legal team, suggesting specific answers that would support his version of events and minimize any impression that she had contributed anything more than secretarial assistance to the patent development process. His desperation was transforming him from confident CEO into a man who realized that his entire professional identity was about to undergo devastating scrutiny. Jessica Williams had built her reputation as one of the most meticulous patent attorneys in the Pacific Northwest by approaching intellectual property disputes with the methodical precision of an archaeologist uncovering ancient civilizations. Her corner office at Morrison, Pierce & Associates was lined with law books and technical journals, creating an environment where complex legal and scientific concepts could be analyzed with equal rigor. When she volunteered to lead the documentary review for the TechCorp litigation, Jessica had expected to spend weeks sorting through the typical collection of corporate files, development notes, and email correspondence that characterized modern intellectual property disputes. The boxes of documentation that Martha Chun had compiled from Innovex Solutions presented an unusually comprehensive record of patent development spanning nearly 2 decades. Jessica had worked on hundreds of similar cases and had learned to recognize the telltale signs of incomplete records, missing documentation, and retroactive file creation that often accompanied companies trying to defend questionable intellectual property claims. The Innovex files were remarkably different, displaying a level of organizational precision and documentary completeness that suggested someone with exceptional attention to detail had maintained these records with almost obsessive care. Jessica began her review with the oldest patents in the collection, working chronologically through the development of algorithms and innovations that had transformed Innovex Solutions from a struggling startup into a technological powerhouse worth billions of dollars. The first surprise came when she opened the original patent application for what Richard Blackwood claimed was his breakthrough data compression algorithm from 15 years earlier. The handwritten technical specifications were extraordinarily detailed, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of mathematical optimization theory and computer science principles that extended far beyond typical patent documentation. The handwriting itself was immediately striking for its feminine precision and academic quality, bearing no resemblance to the hasty masculine scrawl that characterized Richard Blackwood's signature on the formal application documents. Jessica had reviewed thousands of patent applications during her career and had learned to recognize the difference between genuine technical documentation created by actual inventors and the polished presentations typically prepared by patent attorneys for clients who struggled to explain their own innovations. These handwritten specifications had the unmistakable quality of original thought, showing the mathematical derivations and logical progressions that characterized authentic technical breakthroughs. Jessica's attention was immediately drawn to the signature block on the original patent application, where she discovered something that made her reach for her reading glasses and examine the document more carefully. The inventor's signature was not Richard Blackwood's bold scrawl as she had expected, but rather the precise feminine script of someone named Martha Chun. The signature was accompanied by detailed contact information, educational credentials, and a notation indicating that Martha Chun held a doctoral degree in computer science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Richard Blackwood's signature appeared only in the applicant section of the patent application, identifying him as the business entity filing for patent protection on behalf of the actual inventor. This distinction was crucial in patent law, as it clearly established who had conceived and developed the innovation versus who was seeking commercial protection for the intellectual property. Jessica realized that Richard had never actually claimed to be the inventor on the original legal documents, despite spending 15 years publicly presenting himself as the brilliant mind behind these technological breakthroughs. Jessica immediately pulled additional patent files from the collection, working rapidly through applications spanning the entire history of Innovex Solutions. Each document revealed the same pattern, with Martha Chun listed as the inventor on dozens of patents, while Richard Blackwood appeared only as the applicant seeking commercial protection. The consistency was remarkable, suggesting that virtually every significant innovation that had built Richard's technological empire had actually originated from the mind of someone who was publicly known only as his secretary. The technical documentation accompanying each patent application provided compelling evidence of Martha Chen's extraordinary qualifications and innovative capabilities. Her handwritten explanations demonstrated mastery of advanced computer science concepts, elegant mathematical proofs that solved complex algorithmic problems, and creative approaches to technical challenges that had revolutionized multiple aspects of digital technology. Jessica found herself genuinely impressed by the intellectual sophistication of the work, recognizing innovations that had influenced her own understanding of patent law in the technology sector. Jessica's growing excitement about the discovery was tempered by professional concern about the implications for her client's litigation strategy. If Martha Chun was indeed the actual inventor of the disputed patents, then TechCorp's accusations against Richard Blackwood might be fundamentally misdirected. The intellectual property theft might have occurred within Innovex Solutions itself, with Richard claiming credit for innovations that legally belonged to his secretary. This possibility would require completely restructuring TechCorp's legal approach and might actually strengthen their case by providing additional evidence of systematic intellectual property violations. The most damaging discovery came when Jessica found correspondence from the United States Patent and Trademark Office requesting clarification about inventor attribution on several of the disputed patents. The Patent Office had apparently noticed the discrepancy between the public face of Innovex Solutions and the actual inventor listed on the applications, leading to formal inquiries about whether Richard Blackwood had properly attributed intellectual property rights. Martha Chun had responded to these inquiries with detailed technical explanations that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the disputed innovations, while Richard's responses had been notably brief and had avoided specific technical discussions. Jessica immediately requested a meeting with Patricia Summers to discuss the implications of her discoveries before proceeding with additional documentary review. She carried the original patent applications to Patricia's office with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence that would fundamentally reshape a major litigation. Patricia's reaction to the inventor attributions was immediate and profound, as she realized that her client's defense strategy would need complete restructuring based on these revelations about the true source of Innovex Solutions' intellectual property. The decision to interview Martha Chun directly was made immediately, despite Richard Blackwood's obvious discomfort with subjecting his secretary to formal legal questioning. Patricia insisted that any effective defense strategy would require understanding Martha's role in the patent development process and clarifying the relationship between her technical contributions and Richard's business leadership. Jessica prepared for the interview with particular care, recognizing that Martha's testimony could either support or completely undermine Richard's position in the lawsuit. Martha Chun arrived at the law offices of Morrison, Pierce & Associates with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her 15 years at Innovex Solutions. Jessica immediately noticed the contrast between Martha's composed demeanor and Richard Blackwood's obvious anxiety as they settled into the conference room for formal questioning. Martha's responses to preliminary questions revealed detailed knowledge of patent law, intellectual property procedures, and the technical requirements for documenting innovations, suggesting educational background far beyond typical secretarial training. When Jessica presented Martha with the original patent applications bearing her signature as inventor, Martha's explanation was delivered with quiet precision that eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding. She confirmed that she had conceived, developed, and refined every algorithm and innovation listed on the patents, working primarily during evenings and weekends when Richard was not present in the office. Her technical contributions had been voluntary initially, motivated by intellectual curiosity and professional satisfaction rather than recognition or financial compensation. Martha's educational credentials emerged during the interview with the systematic revelation of someone who had deliberately concealed extraordinary qualifications behind the facade of administrative support. Her doctoral dissertation from MIT had focused on algorithmic optimization theory, the same mathematical foundation that underpinned every major innovation at Innovex Solutions. Her published research had been cited by computer scientists around the world, establishing her reputation in academic circles that had no connection to Richard Blackwood's corporate empire. Richard's attempts to minimize Martha's contributions during the interview became increasingly desperate and contradictory as Jessica pressed for specific details about the patent development process. His claim that Martha had simply transcribed his verbal instructions was undermined by the mathematical sophistication of the original documentation, which demonstrated mastery of concepts that Richard clearly did not understand. When asked to explain specific algorithmic approaches that he supposedly had invented, Richard's responses revealed fundamental gaps in his technical knowledge that made his claimed authorship impossible. The interview revealed that Martha had maintained comprehensive records of her technical work throughout her tenure at Innovex Solutions, creating a documentary trail that would make disputes about intellectual property ownership virtually impossible. She had preserved original research notes, preliminary calculations, development timelines, and correspondence with technical consultants, all of which established clear evidence of her creative process and innovative contributions. Richard's parallel documentation was notably absent, consisting primarily of business correspondence and marketing materials that demonstrated his commercial exploitation of innovations rather than his technical development of them. Jessica's questioning revealed the full scope of Martha's deliberate choice to remain in the background, while Richard claimed credit for her innovations. Family obligations had made steady employment more valuable than professional recognition, leading to her calculated decision to accept secretarial compensation in exchange for allowing Richard to present himself as the innovative genius behind Innovex Solutions. The arrangement had provided financial stability while enabling her to pursue technical challenges that satisfied her intellectual interests, creating a sustainable dynamic that had persisted for 15 years. The most devastating revelation came when Martha produced correspondence with patent attorneys from the early days of Innovex Solutions, clearly establishing her understanding of intellectual property law and her deliberate decision to maintain legal ownership of her innovations while permitting Richard to exploit them commercially. She had structured the patent applications to protect her rights while enabling Richard's business success, creating legal documentation that would support her claims if circumstances ever required asserting her intellectual property ownership. Richard's complete psychological collapse became evident as the scope of Martha's technical authority and legal sophistication became undeniable. His desperate attempts to maintain the fiction of his innovative genius were contradicted by overwhelming evidence that established Martha as the actual creator of virtually every significant breakthrough that had built his corporate empire. The man who had spent 15 years basking in unearned recognition was forced to confront the reality that his secretary had always been the brilliant mind behind his supposed intellectual achievements. Jessica concluded the interview with profound respect for Martha's technical capabilities and strategic thinking, while developing serious concerns about her firm's ability to defend Richard against accusations that were proving to be entirely accurate. The intellectual property theft that TechCorp had alleged was indeed systematic and extensive, but it had occurred within Innovex Solutions rather than between competing companies. Richard Blackwood had built his entire professional identity on innovations that legally belonged to the woman he had dismissed as merely his secretary for 15 years. The formal deposition was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning in the 32nd floor conference room of Morrison, Pierce & Associates, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a commanding view of the Seattle skyline that neither Richard Blackwood nor Martha Chen seemed to notice as they took their seats across from each other at the polished mahogany table. Jessica Williams had spent the previous evening preparing questions that would systematically expose the truth about intellectual property ownership at Innovex Solutions, while court reporter Susan Martinez positioned her stenography equipment with practiced efficiency that suggested she had documented thousands of similar confrontations between corporate executives and their accusers. Richard arrived 20 minutes early with his attorney Patricia Summers and two junior associates who carried briefcases full of documents that were intended to support his increasingly desperate claims of innovative authorship. His expensive charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair was professionally styled, and his confident demeanor was carefully constructed to project the image of a successful technology executive defending his legitimate intellectual property rights against frivolous legal harassment. However, Jessica noticed the subtle signs of anxiety that expensive clothing could not conceal. The slight tremor in his hands as he arranged papers, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with Martha, and the forced nature of his smile when he greeted the legal team. Martha entered the conference room with the quiet dignity that had characterized her 15 years at Innovex Solutions, wearing a simple navy blue dress that was professional without being ostentatious, carrying only a single leather portfolio that contained documents she had prepared for the deposition. Her composure was remarkable for someone who was about to undergo intensive legal questioning that could fundamentally alter her professional life. And Jessica noted the contrast between Martha's calm preparation and Richard's obvious nervousness as the formal proceedings began. Jessica opened the deposition by asking Richard to describe his educational background and technical qualifications, establishing for the record the foundation upon which he claimed to have developed the disputed patents. Richard's responses revealed a bachelor's degree in business administration from a regional university, followed by an MBA from a program that emphasized entrepreneurship rather than technical innovation. His work experience prior to founding Innovex Solutions had been entirely in sales and marketing roles for technology companies, with no hands-on involvement in product development, algorithm design, or technical research that would have prepared him for the innovations he claimed as his intellectual property. When Jessica asked Richard to explain the mathematical foundations underlying his supposedly revolutionary data compression algorithm, his response revealed fundamental gaps in his technical knowledge that made his claimed authorship obviously impossible. He spoke in vague generalities about efficiency and optimization while avoiding specific mathematical concepts, and when pressed for details about algorithmic complexity or computational theory, he became evasive and suggested that such technical minutiae were not relevant to his role as an innovative business leader who focused on big-picture strategic thinking rather than implementation details. Richard's desperation became apparent when Jessica presented him with the original patent applications bearing Martha's signature as the inventor, asking him to reconcile his public claims of authorship with the legal documentation that identified someone else as the actual creator of the disputed technologies. His explanation was a confused mixture of claims that Martha had merely transcribed his verbal instructions, that she had assisted with documentation while he provided the creative concepts, and that the patent office required technical personnel to sign applications even when the innovations originated from business executives like himself. Martha's testimony began with Jessica asking her to describe her educational credentials and professional qualifications, leading to the systematic revelation of academic achievements that had been deliberately concealed during her tenure at Innovex Solutions. Her doctoral degree in computer science from MIT was accompanied by published research in algorithmic optimization that had been cited by scientists and engineers around the world, establishing her reputation as a recognized expert in the exact technical areas that had supposedly been Richard's innovative breakthroughs. When Jessica asked Martha to explain her role in developing the disputed patents, her response was delivered with the precision and authority of someone who had intimate knowledge of every technical detail, every creative decision, and every problem-solving breakthrough that had created the innovations in question. She described working late into the evening and throughout weekends, using her personal computer and research access to develop mathematical proofs and algorithmic solutions while Richard was attending social events, playing golf with potential investors, or traveling to business conferences where he would present her work as evidence of his technical genius. Martha's explanation of the algorithm development process revealed the depth of her technical expertise and the systematic nature of her creative contributions. She could recall specific challenges that had required innovative solutions, mathematical approaches that had failed before successful breakthroughs were achieved, and optimization techniques that had improved performance beyond initial expectations. Her detailed knowledge extended to implementation considerations, computational complexity analysis, and theoretical foundations that demonstrated mastery of advanced computer science concepts far beyond Richard's educational background or professional experience. The revelation of Martha's family circumstances provided context for her decision to remain in the background, while Richard claimed credit for her innovations. Her elderly parents required expensive medical care for chronic conditions that would have made employment interruption financially catastrophic. Her younger brother with developmental disabilities depended on her support for specialized programs and therapeutic interventions, and her daughter was pursuing an engineering degree at Stanford University with tuition costs that demanded steady income rather than the uncertain financial rewards of pursuing patent disputes or seeking new employment that recognized her technical qualifications. Martha's strategic thinking became apparent when she explained her deliberate choice to structure the original patent applications to maintain her legal rights as the inventor while permitting Richard to exploit the innovations commercially through his role as business applicant. She had consulted with patent attorneys during the early development process to ensure that her intellectual property ownership would be protected, creating legal documentation that would support her claims if circumstances ever required asserting her rights against Richard's public persona as the innovative genius behind Innovex Solutions. The most shocking discovery emerged when Jessica asked Martha about her ownership stake in Innovex Solutions, leading to the revelation that her patents represented the legal foundation for the company's most valuable intellectual property assets. Martha had retained ownership rights that entitled her to licensing fees and equity participation based on the commercial success of her innovations, creating a financial stake in the company that far exceeded her secretarial salary and made her one of the largest beneficial owners of Innovex Solutions despite her invisible role in corporate operations. Richard's psychological breakdown became undeniable as the scope of Martha's technical authority and legal rights was systematically revealed during her testimony. His attempts to interrupt her explanations with contradictory claims were increasingly desperate and contradictory, revealing a man who was watching his entire professional identity collapse under the weight of evidence that he could not refute or explain away. The confident executive who had entered the deposition room was transforming into someone who realized that 15 years of stolen credit was about to demand comprehensive accounting. Martha's quiet revelation that she had maintained detailed records of every innovation, every development milestone, and every creative breakthrough provided the final evidence needed to establish the systematic nature of Richard's intellectual property theft. She had preserved original research notes written in her handwriting, preliminary calculations that showed her mathematical thinking process, correspondence with technical consultants who had assisted with specific implementation details, and even audio recordings of late-night brainstorming sessions where she had worked through complex problems that became the foundation for patents that Richard later claimed as his innovations. The documentation that Martha presented during the deposition created an unbreakable chain of evidence establishing her creative authorship of virtually every significant technological advancement that had built Innovex Solutions from a struggling startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. Her records included timestamped files that predated Richard's involvement in technical decision-making, email correspondence with MIT professors who had provided consultation on theoretical problems, and research collaborations with other computer scientists who could testify about Martha's recognized expertise in the relevant technical areas. Richard's desperate attempt to salvage his position involved claiming that Martha had somehow stolen his ideas and falsified documentation to support fraudulent patent applications. But this argument collapsed immediately when Jessica presented evidence of Martha's academic publications that had established her expertise years before she ever met Richard Blackwood. Her published research had created the theoretical foundation for innovations that were later developed into the patents that Richard claimed as his intellectual property, making his accusations of theft logically impossible and demonstrably false. The deposition concluded with Richard's complete capitulation as he realized that his options had been reduced to either admitting systematic intellectual property theft or facing criminal charges for perjury in addition to the civil litigation that was already threatening to destroy his business empire. His transformation from confident CEO to defeated fraudster was witnessed by court reporters, attorneys, and legal staff who had observed his public persona crumble under systematic examination of evidence that made denial impossible. Martha's final testimony revealed the extent to which she had anticipated this moment of reckoning, explaining that her decision to maintain comprehensive documentation had been motivated by her understanding that truth would eventually demand accounting for the 15 years of credit that Richard had stolen from her innovations. She had prepared for this confrontation with the same methodical precision that characterized her technical work, creating an evidentiary foundation that would support her rights when circumstances required asserting her ownership of the intellectual property that had built Richard's corporate empire. Patricia Summers found herself in the impossible position of representing a client whose criminal liability was becoming undeniable as the deposition revealed the systematic nature of his intellectual property theft. Her legal strategy shifted from defending Richard's innovation claims to negotiating damage control that might prevent criminal prosecution while acknowledging Martha's rights to the patents that legally belonged to her. The confident defense that had been planned before the deposition was abandoned in favor of settlement discussions that would recognize the reality of Martha's intellectual property ownership and Richard's fraudulent exploitation of her innovations. Jessica concluded the formal questioning with the recognition that the intellectual property dispute had revealed something far more significant than competing claims between technology companies. The case had exposed systematic fraud that had persisted for 15 years, creating legal and financial consequences that would require complete restructuring of Innovex solutions around Martha's actual contributions rather than Richard's false claims of innovative authorship. The woman who had been dismissed as merely a secretary was about to be recognized as the brilliant mind behind one of the most successful technology companies in the Pacific Northwest. Judge Elizabeth Harrison had presided over intellectual property disputes for nearly 2 decades, but the packed courtroom that assembled for the Innovex Solutions patent hearing contained an unusual mixture of technology executives, venture capitalists, and corporate employees who had come to witness what promised to be a landmark case in the relationship between innovative genius and business exploitation. The mahogany-paneled courtroom with its soaring ceilings and formal portraits of distinguished jurists provided an appropriately dignified setting for proceedings that would fundamentally reshape understanding of who had actually created the technological breakthroughs that built Richard Blackwood's billion-dollar empire. Martha Chun entered the courtroom with the same quiet composure that had characterized her 15 years at Innovex Solutions, wearing a professional charcoal gray suit that was elegant without being ostentatious, carrying the leather portfolio that contained documentation supporting her claims to intellectual property ownership. The scattered murmurs that followed her entrance reflected the confusion of observers who recognized her as Richard's long-serving secretary, but could not understand why she was participating in patent proceedings as anything other than a potential witness to corroborate her employer's innovative achievements. Richard Blackwood arrived with Patricia Summers and a team of litigation specialists who had spent weeks preparing final arguments intended to preserve some vestige of his reputation as an innovative business leader despite the devastating evidence that had emerged during discovery proceedings. His expensive navy suit and confident stride were carefully calculated to project authority and credibility, but observers who knew him well could detect signs of strain that expensive tailoring could not entirely conceal. Judge Harrison called the proceedings to order and immediately addressed the unusual nature of the case, explaining that patent ownership disputes typically involve competing claims between different companies or individual inventors rather than questions about attribution within a single corporate entity. She noted that the evidence submitted during discovery had raised fundamental questions about the relationship between innovation and recognition that extended beyond typical intellectual property litigation into issues of systematic fraud and corporate misrepresentation. Patricia Summers opened Richard's defense with a carefully prepared argument that sought to minimize the legal significance of inventor attributions on patent applications while emphasizing Richard's role as the business visionary who had transformed Martha's theoretical contributions into commercially successful products. Her strategy involved acknowledging Martha's technical assistance while maintaining that Richard's entrepreneurial leadership and strategic thinking had been the crucial elements that created value from academic concepts that might otherwise have remained purely theoretical exercises. The argument collapsed immediately when Judge Harrison requested examination of the original patent documentation that established Martha as the legal inventor rather than a technical assistant or collaborator. Patricia's claims about Martha's limited role were contradicted by mathematical proofs, algorithmic specifications, and technical innovations that demonstrated mastery of advanced computer science concepts far beyond what could be characterized as mere assistance or transcription of someone else's ideas. Judge Harrison's examination of the patent timeline revealed the systematic nature of Martha's contributions over nearly 2 decades, with innovations spanning multiple areas of computer science and demonstrating consistent creative authority that made Richard's claims of authorship logically impossible. The documentation showed continuous development of increasingly sophisticated algorithms and mathematical approaches that built upon earlier work, creating a coherent body of intellectual property that reflected the thinking of a single brilliant mind rather than collaborative efforts guided by business leadership. Martha's testimony was delivered with the authoritative precision of someone who possessed intimate knowledge of every technical detail, every creative breakthrough, and every problem-solving innovation that had created the disputed patents. When Judge Harrison asked her to explain the theoretical foundations underlying her data compression algorithm, Martha's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mathematical optimization theory, computational complexity analysis, and algorithmic design principles that left no doubt about her technical expertise and creative authorship. The courtroom's collective gasp was audible when Judge Harrison asked Martha to describe her educational credentials, leading to the systematic revelation of academic achievements that had been concealed during her tenure as Richard's secretary. Her doctoral degree from MIT, her published research that had been cited by computer scientists around the world, and her recognized expertise in algorithmic optimization created a stark contrast with Richard's business background that made his supposed technical innovations obviously impossible. Richard's public humiliation deepened when Judge Harrison asked him to explain specific mathematical concepts underlying patents he claimed to have invented, and his responses revealed fundamental gaps in technical knowledge that made his claimed authorship demonstrably false. His attempts to deflect questions with general business terminology were met with judicial skepticism that made his lack of genuine technical understanding apparent to everyone in the courtroom. The most devastating moment came when Judge Harrison asked Martha to explain why she had chosen to remain in the background, while Richard claimed credit for her innovations. Martha's response revealed family circumstances that had made steady employment more valuable than professional recognition, leading to her calculated decision to structure patent applications that protected her legal rights while enabling Richard's commercial exploitation of her intellectual property. Former colleagues from Innovex Solutions who were present in the courtroom began to recognize their own complicity in dismissing Martha's contributions and accepting Richard's false claims of innovative genius. The technical meetings where Martha had demonstrated superior understanding of complex algorithms, the late nights when she had worked through problems that Richard later presented as his breakthroughs, and the countless instances where her suggestions had been attributed to Richard's leadership were recontextualized as evidence of systematic intellectual property theft. Judge Harrison's formal recognition of Martha's intellectual property ownership was delivered with the judicial authority that transformed legal reality and established her rightful status as the innovative genius behind Innovex Solutions. The court's official acknowledgement that Richard had systematically exploited innovations that legally belonged to his secretary created immediate consequences for corporate governance, financial obligations, and criminal liability that would require complete restructuring of the business empire built on stolen credit. The packed courtroom witnessed Richard's transformation from confident technology executive to exposed fraudster, as Judge Harrison's ruling eliminated any remaining possibility of maintaining his false claims of innovative authorship. His 15-year deception had been methodically dismantled by evidence that made denial impossible, and the public nature of the proceedings ensured that his professional reputation would never recover from the systematic exposure of his intellectual property theft. Martha's quiet dignity during her moment of vindication reflected the patience and strategic thinking that had enabled her to endure 15 years of stolen credit while building an unshakable foundation of evidence that would eventually demand comprehensive accounting. Her transformation from invisible secretary to recognized innovator was witnessed by the business community that had previously dismissed her as merely administrative support for Richard's supposed genius. The emergency board meeting convened 3 days after Judge Harrison's ruling established Martha Chun as the rightful owner of the intellectual property that had built Innovex Solutions into a technological powerhouse worth billions of dollars. The mahogany conference room that had once hosted Richard Blackwood's triumphant presentations to investors and venture capitalists was now filled with board members, legal advisors, and corporate executives who were grappling with the unprecedented challenge of restructuring a company around its actual innovator rather than the fraudulent figurehead who had claimed credit for her achievements for 15 years. Martha arrived at the corporate headquarters for the board meeting with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her years as Richard's secretary, but everything about her relationship to the building had fundamentally changed during the 3 days since the court proceedings. She walked through the marble lobby where security guards now addressed her with respectful deference, past the executive suites where her innovations had been displayed as evidence of Richard's genius, toward the conference room where she would be formally recognized as the chief technology officer and primary intellectual property owner of the company she had actually built through her creative brilliance. The board's unanimous decision to terminate Richard Blackwood's employment was announced with the clinical precision appropriate for removing someone whose continued presence would expose the company to additional legal liability and public relations disasters. His 15-year tenure as CEO was officially ended with immediate effect. His corporate access was revoked, and his claims to any future participation in company operations were permanently severed. The man who had built his entire professional identity on stolen innovations was escorted from the building by security personnel, while his former colleagues watched with the uncomfortable recognition of their own complicity in his deception. Martha's appointment as Chief Technology Officer was accompanied by a comprehensive restructuring of corporate governance that acknowledged her rightful authority over the innovations that had created the company's value. Her new compensation package included equity ownership reflecting her intellectual property contributions, licensing fees for her patents that had generated billions in corporate revenue, and recognition of her status as the primary creative force behind Innovex Solutions' technological breakthroughs. The board's formal apology for 15 years of dismissing her contributions was delivered with the institutional dignity appropriate for acknowledging systematic injustice. The transformation of corporate culture began immediately as Martha assumed her rightful position of authority within the organization she had actually built. Employees who had previously treated her with the casual dismissal reserved for administrative staff now recognized her as the innovative genius whose algorithms and mathematical breakthroughs had created their technological superiority. The cognitive dissonance was apparent as longtime staff members struggled to reconcile their memories of the quiet secretary with the revealed reality of her extraordinary technical qualifications and creative achievements. Richard's desperate attempts to negotiate some form of continued involvement with Innovex Solutions were met with the cold legal precision of attorneys who understood that any association with him would compromise the company's efforts to rebuild credibility after the systematic fraud had been exposed. His claims that he deserved recognition for business leadership and strategic vision were rejected as attempts to maintain some vestige of credit for achievements that belonged entirely to Martha. The finality of his professional exile was appropriate for someone who had spent 15 years stealing recognition from the person who had actually earned it. Former investors and business partners who had enthusiastically supported Richard's supposed innovative genius were forced to confront their fundamental misunderstanding of who had actually created the technological breakthroughs they had celebrated and funded. Their embarrassment was compounded by the recognition that they had consistently dismissed and overlooked the actual innovator while showering praise and financial support on someone whose only contribution had been systematic intellectual property theft. The venture capitalists who had attributed Richard's success to entrepreneurial brilliance were learning that their investment returns had been built entirely on Martha's concealed technical expertise. Martha's gracious handling of her vindication reflected the same strategic thinking and emotional intelligence that had enabled her to endure 15 years of stolen credit while building an unshakable foundation of evidence for eventual justice. She accepted congratulations and recognition with quiet dignity, avoiding any expression of bitterness or recrimination that might have been understandable given the scope of injustice she had experienced. Her focus remained on the technical challenges and innovative opportunities that had always motivated her work, rather than dwelling on the personal satisfaction of watching Richard's fraudulent empire collapse. The establishment of the Martha Chin Foundation for Unrecognized Innovation created a lasting institutional legacy that would support other brilliant minds who might be laboring in obscurity while their contributions were claimed by others. The foundation's mission to identify and support undervalued innovators, particularly women and minorities working in technical fields, represented Martha's commitment to ensuring that systematic intellectual property theft would not prevent future innovators from receiving appropriate recognition for their achievements. Martha's first day in the corner office that had previously been Richard's sanctuary for practicing his fraudulent presentations was marked by her quiet satisfaction at finally working in an environment that acknowledged her true role in creating the innovations displayed throughout the corporate headquarters. The mathematical proofs and algorithmic specifications that adorned the walls were now properly attributed to their actual creator, and the technical achievements that had built the company's reputation were finally recognized as products of her intellectual brilliance rather than Richard's non-existent genius. The broader implications of Martha's vindication extended far beyond Innovex Solutions as other technology companies began examining their own attribution practices and questioning whether their celebrated innovators might be claiming credit for contributions made by overlooked team members. The case had exposed systematic problems in corporate culture that consistently undervalued technical contributions from women, minorities, and employees whose formal titles did not reflect their actual creative authority. Martha's story was inspiring similar revelations across the technology industry as other hidden innovators found courage to assert their rightful claims to intellectual property ownership. Richard's attempts to rebuild his professional reputation in other markets were consistently undermined by the public nature of his exposure as someone who had built his entire career on systematic intellectual property theft. His professional exile was complete and permanent, as no reputable technology company would associate with someone whose fraudulent practices had been so thoroughly documented and publicized. The man who had spent 15 years basking in unearned recognition was learning that stolen credit extracted a price that extended far beyond financial consequences into complete professional destruction. Martha's final act of the day was to walk through the research and development departments where teams of engineers and computer scientists were working on innovations that would build upon the foundation she had created during her years of concealed brilliance. She paused at each workstation to observe the technical challenges being addressed, offering suggestions and insights with the natural authority of someone whose mathematical genius had created the theoretical framework that made their current research possible. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been dismissed as only a secretary was now properly recognized as the innovative mind whose achievements had built one of the most successful technology companies in the world. As Martha settled into her new office for the evening, reviewing research proposals and technical specifications that would guide the company's future development, she reflected on the strange justice that had finally acknowledged 15 years of stolen credit while opening new possibilities for continued innovation and creative achievement. The patient strategic thinking that had enabled her to endure systematic dismissal while building an unshakable foundation of evidence had been rewarded with complete vindication and the opportunity to pursue technical challenges under her own name rather than through someone else's fraudulent claims of genius. The story that began with a secretary organizing files and enduring condescending dismissal had concluded with that same person being recognized as one of the most innovative technology leaders of her generation, holding patents that had transformed multiple industries and created billions in economic value. Her quiet dignity in handling both injustice and vindication had established her as a model for other hidden innovators whose contributions might be waiting for similar moments of recognition and appropriate attribution. What did you think of Martha's incredible journey from dismissed secretary to recognized innovator? Have you ever witnessed someone in your own workplace whose contributions seemed undervalued or overlooked? Stories like these remind us that brilliance often hides in unexpected places, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this revelation might change the way we recognize true innovation versus taking credit for others' work.